The ship was too quiet for Mara Voss. She had been on military transports before. She had been on cargo haulers and broken shuttles held together with wire and hope. But this ship was different. This ship was clean and smooth, and the air smelled like something that had no name in any human language. The seats were built for bodies that were not human-shaped, and Mara sat in hers with her knees pressed together and her hands folded in her lap, and she looked out the window at the stars, and she did not say a word. She was 29 years old. She had 3 scars on her left arm, 1 on her chin, and a small circular burn mark on the back of her right hand. She had earned all of them. She did not think about them the way other people thought about their scars. She thought about them the way a carpenter thinks about the marks on an old workbench as proof that something real had been built there. Behind her, the 5 other human students were talking quietly. Dax Okafor was laughing about something he was always laughing. He was a big man with a wide smile and hands that had broken and healed so many times that the knuckles looked like small hills. He had been a soldier before he became a student, just like Mara. He treated pain the way most people treat bad weather, as something that happens and then stops. Beside him sat Priya Nair, who was reading on a small tablet and had been reading since the ship left Earth orbit. She studied xenobiology, and she had spent the last 3 years learning everything written about every alien species in the Galactic Academic Consortium. She had memorized their biology, their customs, their history. She had not memorized how to deal with people looking at her like she was something small. Other 3 students sat further back. Their names were Leon Park and Sable Torres, and a quiet young man everyone called Finn, who had grown up on a fishing boat in Norway and had the kind of stillness that comes from years of watching the ocean decide whether to be calm or kill you. They were the first 6 humans ever admitted to Ethon Prime Institute. Galactic Academic Consortium had debated this for 11 years. The debate was not about human intelligence. Humans were smart enough by galactic standards. The debate was about something else. It was about fragility. Every species in the consortium had been catalogued and measured and studied, and humans had come out near the bottom of one very specific chart: pain tolerance. The galactic average pain threshold was measured in units called Verith, and the average sentient species registered somewhere between 40 and 90 Verith before their nervous system began to shut down. Drekai, who were stone-skinned and massive, registered over 200. The Thin, who were small and insect-like, still managed 65. Humans registered 22. Verith before the body began to scream, before the mind began to beg, before the system started breaking down. The consortium records described the human nervous system as extraordinarily sensitive. They used words like fragile and vulnerable, and one particularly blunt report from a Drekai biologist had used the word pitiable. Mara had read that report. She had read all of them. She had printed the word pitiable on a small piece of paper and put it in her pocket, and she still had it. The ship docked at Ethon Prime Station with a soft sound like a sigh. The station was enormous. It hung in orbit around a pale green gas giant, and it was built to hold over 12,000 students from 43 different species. The hallways were wide enough for a Drekai to walk without turning sideways. The ceilings were high enough that the tall, thin Valorians did not have to stoop. The temperature in different sections was adjusted for different biologies, and the human quarters had been specially set to a range that the station coordinator had described in his welcome message as tolerable for your species. Mara had read that too. She had not printed that one when the 6 humans walked off the ship. There was a crowd, not a welcoming crowd. Not exactly a watching crowd. Students of a dozen different species standing in the wide arrival hall and looking at the humans the way children look at something they have heard about but never seen. Curious and a little superior, and not very good at hiding either. Standing at the front of the crowd was Varth, was Drekai, which meant he was nearly 8 feet tall, and his skin was the color of dark stone, and his eyes were deep amber, and he had the posture of someone who had never in his life worried about being the strongest thing in the room. He was the senior student representative, and it was his job to greet new arrivals, and he did it well. He did it with a kind of careful politeness that was almost indistinguishable from contempt. He looked at the 6 humans. He looked at them for a long time. They were so small, not just in height though. They were shorter than almost every species at the station. They were small in a deeper way. Their bones were thin. Their skin had no armor, no shell, no natural protection. Their eyes were soft. Their hands looked like they would bruise if you touched them too hard. One of them, the big one with the wide smile, was bouncing slightly on his heels, like he was excited. And Vara thought that was perhaps the strangest thing of all. Who was excited to be here, who arrived at the most prestigious academic institution in the known galaxy, and bounced on their heels. Vareth gave his welcome speech. He had memorized it. He gave it the same way every intake season, with the same careful warmth and the same professional distance. But when he got to the part about the institution's long history of welcoming all species, he felt something he was not used to feeling. He felt like he was lying, not about the history. That was true about the welcome. He watched Mara Voss as he spoke. She was watching him back. Her eyes were brown and steady, and there was something in them that he could not identify. It was not nervousness. It was not excitement. It was something quieter and harder, and it sat behind her eyes like a stone at the bottom of a clear river. When he finished, she nodded once. Just once, like she had heard exactly what he meant and exactly what he had not said, and had filed both pieces of information away somewhere safe. The crowd began to break up, students drifting back to their sections. The humans were led to their quarters by a junior staff member who spoke too loudly and too slowly, as though they might not understand, and Dax smiled at every ceiling they passed under, as if personally delighted by the architecture Mara walked at. The back of the group, she passed a wall screen that was cycling through the intake profiles of new students. Each profile had a species name, a home world, and a pain tolerance rating listed in Varth. Stopped, she looked at her own profile name, Mara. Voss species human home world Earth pain tolerance 22, Vareth. Below the number in small text was a single word, fragile. She stood there for 3 seconds. Then she took out the small folded piece of paper from her pocket, unfolded it, looked at the word pitiable, and put it back. She walked to her quarters. She unpacked her bag. She put a photograph on the small desk beside her bed. 6 people standing in front of a broken wall in a desert, somewhere, smiling at whoever was holding the camera. 5 of those people were gone now, dead in places that had no good names in any language. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she opened her journal and wrote 3 words: watch what happens. Nobody warned the monitoring staff about what was going to happen. They should have. The empathy gauntlet had been running at Ethon Prime Institute for 60 years without a single incident that the staff could not explain. It was a neural simulation, a mandatory experience for every new intake student every year, and it worked the same way every time. You entered the pod. You put on the headset. The system connected to your nervous system, and for the next few hours you lived inside the sensory experience of a different species. You felt what they felt. You perceived the world through their biology. You came out the other side changed in some small way, and that was the point. Empathy through experience. The consortium believed deeply in this. The pods were calibrated to each species automatically. The system scanned incoming biology and adjusted the simulation intensity, so that no student was ever pushed past 70% of their personal pain threshold. It was considered extremely safe. It had a perfect record. The staff member running the intake session that morning was a Valorian named Essa. She had run over 300 intake sessions. She had a small desk near the monitoring screens and a cup of something warm, and she expected the morning to go the way it always went. She did not expect humans. The 6 humans were the last group of the morning intake. They walked into the simulation room in a loose group Dax, looking at everything with that wide, interested expression. Priya, already taking mental notes, Finn calm and quiet as still water. The other three, alert and steady. And Mara at the back moving the way someone moves when they are very comfortable being the last person to enter a room. Essa explained the process. The standard explanation she had given it hundreds of times. Neural connections, sensory immersion, species, rotation, automatic. Safety cutoffs at 70% threshold. No lasting effects, exit available at any time. Dax raised his hand. Essa looked at him. He asked what happened if you wanted to go past 70%. The room was briefly very quiet. Essa explained patiently that the system did not allow that it was a safety measure, that no student had ever needed or wanted to go past 70%. Dax nodded pleasantly and said okay. He did not seem discouraged. They entered the pods. The session began. The first 30 minutes were normal. The monitoring screens showed steady readings, 6 human subjects moving through the early stages of the simulation, experiencing direct Kai sensory input, then Valorian, then Then. Standard responses, mild discomfort, small stress spikes well within normal range. Essa sipped her drink and made her routine notes. Then the simulation moved into the second phase. The second phase was harder. It was designed to be, it pushed students closer to their personal threshold, not past it, but close enough that the empathy became real, that you understood what other species lived with every day. Essa watched the readings climb for the human subjects, as they always climbed for every student at this stage. She watched them reach 50% of threshold. She watched them reach 60, she watched them reach 65, and she waited for the usual responses. The request to pause, the automatic breathing changes, the small sounds of distress that showed up on the audio monitors. Nothing came. She leaned forward slightly. The readings continued to climb. 68-70. One of the subjects, Mara Voss, hit 70, and the system flagged it and generated an automatic exit prompt on her pod screen. Essa watched the screen. Mara dismissed the prompt. Essa sat up straight. She had never seen that before. She had never in 300 sessions seen a student dismiss the exit prompt at 70%. She pulled up the manual override log. She read it again. Dismissed, manually overridden by subject. She looked at the audio monitor. She could hear something from Mara's pod. She turned up the volume. Mara was breathing slow and deliberate. In through the nose, out through the mouth, like she was counting something, like she was measuring the distance between each breath and the next. She was not in distress. She was working. Essa looked at the other 5 pods. All 6 humans had dismissed the exit prompt. All 6. The readings were climbing again. 72-75. One of them, Dax, was at 78, and Essa could hear him on the audio monitor, and what she heard stopped her hand halfway to the emergency cutoff button. He was laughing, not a performance laugh, not a coping laugh, something genuine, something warm. He said something to whoever was in the pod beside him, and Essa turned up that audio, and it was Finn, and Finn made a short, quiet sound. That was a human laugh too. And then he said something back in a low voice, and the words were, "This is nothing." And Dax said, "Yeah, I know, right." And they both laughed. Again, Essa stared at the screens. The readings were at 80 now. In 60 years of operation, the Gauntlet had never recorded a student group voluntarily sustaining past 70% threshold. The system had not been programmed to handle this, because no one had imagined needing to handle this. Her colleague, a young Drek Kai student assistant named Brahm, came to stand behind her shoulder and looked at the screens and said nothing for a long moment, and then said, "What is happening?" Essa said she did not know. Brahm pointed at Priya's readings, which were the highest in the group at 83%, and said that number is not correct. The system must be malfunctioning. Essa pulled up the diagnostic. System was not malfunctioning. Priya was at 83% of her pain threshold, fully conscious, fully present, and according to the biometric secondary data, she was running deliberate mental exercises to manage the input. Her heart rate was elevated but controlled. Her cortisol was high but not spiking. Her focus indicators were steady. She was managing. If they were all managing it not by being numb, not by ignoring it. The pain was real. The simulation was real. Their nervous systems were receiving every signal and processing every signal. And they were choosing what to do with it after at 87%. The system generated a mandatory staff override prompt, asking ESSA whether to terminate the session. ESSA looked at the prompt for 5 seconds. She looked at the screens. She looked at Mara's pod where the audio showed that slow, deliberate breathing, and the biometrics showed something that ESSA did not have a word for in her own language, but that felt like the closest thing to controlled fire she had ever seen in a living being. She did not terminate the session 40 minutes later. The 6 humans completed the full simulation. They came out of the pods in the way people come out of cold water, alert and slightly dazed and breathing differently and very much alive. Dax rolled his shoulders. Priya rubbed the back of her neck. Finn sat on the edge of his pod with his eyes closed for a moment, like he was listening to something. Mara stood up, looked at ESSA, and asked if there was a debrief form to fill out. ESSA could not speak for a moment. She pulled up the post-session report on her screen and looked at the final numbers. 6 human students. Average sustained threshold during session 81%. Peak threshold Dax Okafor 91%. Duration of voluntary threshold. Override full second phase. She had never written a report like this. She had never had to. She filed it with a flag for the department head, and then she sat very still for a while thinking about the word fragile and how she had read it in the intake profiles that morning and how it was the most wrong word she had ever seen in a document, and she had read a great many documents. That evening, the report reached 12 senior staff members. By the following morning, it had reached 40 students. By the end of the week, it reached. Vorath read it 3 times. Then he looked across the common area to where Mara Voss was sitting alone, eating something from a small container and reading a warm book and not looking up at anyone. He sat with the report in his hands for a long time. He had called them fragile. He had thought the word and believed the word, and the word had felt so completely accurate when he said it. Looked at the numbers again. He looked at Mara. She turned a page. She still did not look up. Vorath did not ask questions. This was important to understand about him. He was not the kind of person who asked questions. He was the kind of person who already knew things. He had grown up on a world where knowing things was how you stayed safe, and asking questions was how you showed weakness. He had carried that into every room he had ever entered at Ethon Prime, and had served him well for 3 years. He asked Mara a question on a Tuesday morning. He found her in the East Wing training room where the humans had taken to doing their morning exercise before the rest of the station was fully awake. She was doing something on the floor that his biology database identified as a human push-up, which involved lowering and raising her entire body using only her arms repeatedly, and doing it fast enough that Voreth counted 40 before she stopped. She stopped because she heard him come in. She looked up from the floor and then stood and picked up a small cloth and wiped her face and looked at him with those steady brown eyes and waited. He had prepared a careful, formal opening. He had written it out. He had 3 follow-up questions arranged in order of importance. He had a closing statement ready. He said none of it but he said, "Was I read the gauntlet report?" She nodded. He said the numbers should not be possible. She said they were, though. Stood there for a moment. He was 8 feet of stone-skinned muscle and ancient bloodline and institutional authority, and he had the distinct sensation of being very slightly off balance. He asked her how, not how in a technical sense. He had the technical data, the biometrics, the threshold readings, the override logs. He had all of that. He meant how in a way that cannot be answered by a chart. He meant how do you feel that much and keep moving. Mara looked at him for a moment, like she was deciding something. Then she sat down on the floor, cross-legged, like she was settling in for something longer than a short answer. And she said, "Sit down." He said it was strange. It was a strange thing to do to lower himself to the floor of the training room because a small human woman asked him to. But he did it, and then they were sitting across from each other at roughly the same eye level, and she started talking. She told him about childbirth. She said that for most of human history, a woman giving birth had nothing to help her. No medicine, no tools, nothing. She said the pain of it was documented in every culture across every century as one of the most intense experiences a human body could survive. She said that women went through it, and then got up and fed their children, and worked and survived, and then often did it again. Vareth was quiet. She told him about a man named Ernest Shackleton, who had sailed to the bottom of the world with a crew of 27 men, and when his ship was destroyed by ice, he walked 800 miles across the most hostile terrain on Earth with no rescue coming and no guarantee he would survive, and he did it anyway. And when he got home, he immediately started planning to go back. Vareth said he did not understand why Mara said that was okay. Most humans didn't fully understand it either. They just knew it was true. She told him about soldiers. She did not talk about war in the abstract. She talked about specific things. Bodies that kept moving after they should have stopped. Hands that kept working after they should have given up. People who were shot and still dragged their friends to safety. People who were broken in a dozen ways and kept saying not yet to death until they got everyone out. She said pain was a signal. It was the body saying something is wrong. She said humans heard that signal more loudly than almost anything else in the galaxy. Then she said, but hearing a signal does not mean you have to obey it. Vareth thought about this. He said, but why would you choose not to obey it? Pain is information. It is the body protecting itself. Mara nodded. She said yes, that was true. She said pain told you where the damage was. It told you how bad things were. It gave you accurate information. She said the thing humans had learned was that accurate information and correct action were not always the same thing. Sometimes the damage was real, and you had to stop. Sometimes the damage was real, and stopping meant something worse happened. She said humans had spent a very long time in situations where stopping meant dying, where stopping meant the person next to you died, where stopping meant everything you had come all this way for was lost. And somewhere in that long, hard history, the species had developed something. It was not numbness. It was not armor. It was not a high threshold. It was a choice. A practiced, deliberate choice to feel everything and then decide separately what to do about it. Vareth said that sounded like suffering. Mara said yes. Sometimes it was he was quiet again. Then she told him about her unit. She did not do it dramatically. She did it the way you talk about something that is very heavy, but that you have carried long enough that your arms have learned the shape of it. She said there were 6 of them. She looked at him and said he had probably noticed she kept a photograph of 6 people on her desk. He had not noticed he had not been in her quarters. He had not thought about her desk. But he nodded anyway. She said, 3 years ago, they were on a mission in a place that had no good name in any language, and 2 of them were hurt bad, and they needed to get out, and the route back was closed, and her team leader, who was the best person she had ever known, had said to her, we go through the hard way, and she had said, how bad is it going to be? And he had said, pretty bad, and she had said, okay. She stopped at Vareth, waited. She said they got 4 people out. They lost 2. She said the 2 they lost were named Jane Zidami and Yui Tanaka, and they were both 24 years old. And they were both funnier than anyone she had ever met, and they were gone. And she still heard James laughing sometimes in dreams. She said she woke up the morning after with pain she could not measure. It was not physical. It was something that went all the way through her. It was the kind of pain that the Vareth scale had no units for. She said she lay in her bunk and she thought about staying there. She thought about it seriously. She thought about what it would mean to simply stop. Then she got up. Vareth said why. She looked at him directly and said because the alternative is to stop, and stopping means whatever hurt you wins. The training room was completely silent. Vareth did not move for a long time. He was a Drekai. He had been taught that strength was the absence of weakness, that the measure of a warrior was how little they could be damaged, that the ideal was to feel nothing, because to feel nothing was to need nothing, and to need nothing was to be safe. Sat across from a woman who felt everything, who had lost people she loved in ways that left marks that did not show on any scan, who had the lowest pain threshold in the room by every measurable standard, who was the most unbreakable thing he had ever encountered. He did not have words for this. In his own language, he looked for them and could not find them. Behind them from the doorway came the quiet sound of someone shifting weight thessily. The young alien medic student had been standing in the doorway for 11 minutes. She had come for her own morning training and had heard voices and had stopped and listened and had not moved because she was afraid that if she moved the conversation would end. She was holding a small recording device. She had pressed record 9 minutes ago. Her hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, from the feeling you get when you witness something that you know you will spend the rest of your life thinking about. She pressed stop. She would write her thesis in 14 months. It would be titled Voluntary Threshold Persistence in Human Subjects, a study in chosen endurance, and it would be translated into the languages of 40 species and distributed across 11 star systems and read by people who would read it twice and then sit quietly for a while. But that was later. Right now in the training room, Mara stood up and offered Vorath her hand in the human greeting gesture, and after a brief pause, he took it carefully, as though her bones might break. They did not break. She shook his hand firmly and said, "Good talk," and something that had never happened to Vorath in 3 years at Ethon Prime happened. He smiled first. The alarm did not sound like a warning. It sounded like a fact. It hit every speaker on the station at once at 3:40 in the afternoon on a Thursday, and it was a low flat tone that meant structural failure, and it was a tone that most of the 12,000 students at Ethon Prime had heard in drills but never in reality. And for 3 full seconds after it started, nobody moved, because the body does not believe bad things are happening until it has to. Then everyone moved at once. The Bethune failure was in the lower research wing, section 7A. Cascade breakdown in the thermal regulation system had triggered a pressure seal rupture, which had caused 2 internal bulkheads to collapse, which had triggered a third. And by the time the automated damage report reached the station emergency coordinator, there were 4 collapsed corridors and 31 students trapped behind them in a section where the atmosphere was slowly venting and the temperature was rising. 31 students, 14 different species. The emergency coordinator was a Valorian named Sath, and she had run drills for this, and her hands were steady and her voice was steady, and she began the response protocol with the speed of someone who had memorized every step. She dispatched repair drones. She contacted the medical bay. She activated the rescue teams. The repair drones could not reach Section 7. The debris field was too dense, too random, too structurally unstable for automated systems to navigate the Pemaeus. Drones kept getting blocked, kept getting stuck, kept returning to base with failure codes. The rescue teams arrived at the collapsed entry points, and the problem became immediately cleared. Corridors into Section 7 were narrow, and they were filled with superheated wreckage and sharp collapsed metal and unstable overhead structures that could come down at any moment. The temperature near the entry points was reading 61 degrees Celsius, which was above the safe operational range for Drekkai biology and far above it for most other species. The debris pieces that needed to be moved were large and hot and jagged, and the footing was on loose broken panels over a drop. 3 Drekkai volunteers attempted entry. The first made it 6 meters before an overhead structure shifted and she had to retreat. The second made it 9 meters before a panel gave way under his foot and the drop nearly took him. The third refused the heat sensor readings and entered anyway and made it 11 meters before the debris density became physically impassable for someone his size. The corridor needed someone small. It needed someone who could fit through gaps that a Drekkai could not. someone who could move on unstable footing, someone who could navigate heat and sharp metal and uncertainty and keep going in. The crowd that had gathered at the entry point, Mara Voss was already tying her hair back. She did not ask permission. She walked to Sath and said, "We can go in," and Sath looked at her and then looked at the temperature readings and then looked at her again and said, "The heat will damage your tissue." And Mara said, "Yes." And Sath said, "The metal edges are extremely sharp." And Mara said, "Yes." And Sath said, "The structure is unstable. There is a real possibility that it comes down." And Mara said yes to all of it. Then she said, "There are 31 people in there." Sath looked at her for one more second. Then she stepped aside. All 6 humans geared up in 90 seconds. They took what? The station had emergency gloves, emergency suits not built for this temperature, but better than nothing. They took comb units and small cutting tools and rope. They took the station map of Section 7. Dax rolled his shoulders and said quietly to Leon, "This is going to hurt." And Leon said, "Yeah." And Dax said, "Good thing we're used to that." And Leon almost smiled. They went in. The heat hit like a wall. It was not metaphorical. It was physical. It pressed against the skin immediately, and the emergency suits helped for the first few seconds, and then the heat found the edges, found the gaps, and started working its way in. Mara moved at the front, picking the path, choosing each step, testing the floor, the floor putting weight on it. Her hands were already feeling the warmth through the gloves. 10 meters in, she stepped on a piece of panel that shifted, and her left knee came down on exposed metal. She felt the slice of it. She did not stop. She moved forward. Behind her, Dax was moving wreckage. He was lifting pieces of collapsed bulkhead with his hands and stacking them to the side to widen the path, and the metal was hot enough that even through the gloves, she could hear him making a sound, a low, controlled breath through his teeth each time he gripped a new piece, and she knew what that sound meant, and she also knew he was not stopping. 15 meters in, Priya's cum crackled. She said she could hear voices ahead. Mara pressed her cum and called out into the dark and dust and heat, and a voice came back. Multiple voices, high and desperate, and then something in them that changed when they heard a human voice coming toward them. Something that was not hope exactly, but was the direction hope lives in. 20 meters in Dax's shoulder gave out. He did not announce it. He did not stop. He felt the joint go, felt the specific tearing sensation of a dislocated shoulder, and he put his hand against the wall and he breathed. And then he grabbed the displaced arm with his other hand and he reset it himself with a sound that made Finn wince 3 meters away. And then he picked up the next piece of wreckage. Finn said, "Are you okay?" Dax said, "Not really." Finn said, "Keep going." Dax said, "Obviously." They kept going. Mara reached the first trapped group at 26 meters in. 7 students of 4 different species huddled in a section where one wall had partially held. They were frightened, and some were hurt, and one, a small, thin student, had a broken arm and was barely conscious. Mara looked at them and said, "We are going to get everyone out." And her voice was the same voice she had used in a desert 3 years ago, when she had said the same thing and meant it the same way. She started moving them back toward the entry point, 1 and 2 at a time. The next 40 minutes were the kind of minutes that do not feel like minutes. Sable found a second group deeper in, and the corridor to reach them had a section where the ceiling was down to 1.5 meters, and she moved through it on her hands and knees on hot metal, and she did not think about anything except the next meter. Lyle found a Drek Kai student pinned under a collapsed beam. The beam was too heavy for one person. He called Dax, and Dax came, and together they lifted it, and the Drek Kai student was twice their size, and they got under his arms and moved him. Anyway, Priya found a Valorian student who was in shock, and she sat with her for 4 minutes in 65-degree heat, talking her down, talking her back into her body, telling her the path was clear, telling her she just had to stand up and walk, and the Valorian student stood up and walked. Last person out was Mara. She came out of the entry point with a thin child in her arms, a tiny, fragile being who had stopped responding and needed to be carried. and she was bleeding from her forearm where a piece of metal had caught her, and the blood had dried in a dark line from her elbow to her wrist, and her suit was torn in 3 places, and she was limping slightly on the knee. She had hit 26 meters in. She walked out into the bright lights of the emergency response area. She looked around. She counted 31 people. She handed the thin child to a medic. Then the medics came for her, and she held up one hand and said, "Give me a second," and she walked along the line of rescued students, quickly checking each face, each pair of eyes, saying something small to each one before she let the medics near Harvath had been standing at the barrier since Mara went in. He had watched the temperature readings. He had watched the structural stability scans. He had watched the ceiling collapse probability counter climb past 40% and then 50%. He had stood at the barrier with his fists closed and said nothing and done nothing because there was nothing he could do, and that was the worst thing he had ever experienced. He watched Mara come out. He watched her check every single person before she let them treat her own wounds. He had no words. He had stopped looking for them. He stood at the barrier, and he thought about a word he had used once in a document. He had written about human intake biology. He thought about the word fragile. He thought about how he had been so completely certain. He watched Mara finally sit down on a crate and let a medic take her arm, and he watched her look up at the ceiling of the bay with an expression that was tired and sad and completely at peace, all at the same time. He thought that was the bravest face he had ever seen on any being in any species in his entire life, and he understood for the first time that he had been reading the wrong data. The Verith scale measured how much pain a body could take before it stopped. It had never once measured what a being chose to do while the pain was happening. Those were not the same number. They had never been the same number, and humans had the widest gap between those two numbers of anything the galaxy had ever produced. The Grand Assembly Hall of Ethon Prime had been built to hold every student and faculty member on the station at the same time. It had never been full. It was full now, every seat taken. Every standing space filled, students pressed along the back walls and the upper observation ring, and standing in the corridors outside where the audio was piped through the speakers. 12,000 people from 43 species, all listening to the same hearing, and the hall was so quiet that the ventilation systems were the loudest sound in the room. At the center table sat the 7 senior members of the Galactic Academic Consortium Review Board. They were here because 31 students had nearly died. They were here because the incident report had contained things that the board had read multiple times and still were not certain they understood. They were here because a junior medic student named Thessaly had filed a supplementary document with her incident testimony, and that document had been forwarded up the chain until it reached the person who forwarded things to the board, and that person had read it and forwarded it immediately without waiting for morning. And they were here because 6 human students had done something that nobody on this station, or apparently on any station in the consortium's 60-year history, had been prepared for. Hearing opened with the formal review of events. The emergency coordinator gave her account. She was precise and factual. She described the failure, the drone failures, the rescue team attempts, the temperature readings, the structural risk. She described the moment Mara Voss had said, "We can go in," and she had stepped aside. One board member, a senior Drek, Kai named Orath, asked whether she had considered refusing the human volunteers on safety grounds. Seth said, yes. He asked why she had not. She said, because the alternative was leaving 31 people in a venting section, and the humans were the only option that had a chance of working. He asked how she had known they had a chance. She paused. She looked down at her notes. She looked up again. She said she had read the Gauntlet report. The hall was quiet. The second testimony was Thessaly. She was young enough that her official academic status still said junior, and she stood at the testimony podium with her data tablet in both hands and her notes visible on the screen behind her. And she was visibly nervous, and she spoke anyway. She said she wanted to present her findings. She said she understood this was a safety hearing, and not an academic review, but she believed her findings were directly relevant to the question the board was really asking, which was not what happened in Section 7, but what humans are. She said she had been studying humans for 4 months. She said she had started after the Gauntlet incident. She said she had used biometric data and behavioral observation and recorded testimony, and she had expected to find an anomaly, a mistake in the species assessment, a calibration error somewhere. She had not found an error. What she had found was this human pain. Sensitivity was real and accurately measured. They felt more than most species. They registered stimuli more intensely. Their nervous systems were not insulated against sensation, the way most galactic species were over long evolutionary periods. They heard more readily and more completely than almost anything the consortium had catalogued, and they had the lowest rate of pain-driven behavioral shutdown of any sentient species ever studied. She let that sit in the room for a moment. She said those two facts seemed to contradict each other. She said every biological model predicted that a species with very high sensitivity should develop very strong avoidance behaviors, should stop quickly to prevent damage, should treat pain as a hard stop. Humans had not done this. Not because they could not feel it. She wanted to be very clear about this. They could feel it. They felt it fully and completely and in detail. But somewhere in their evolutionary history, in their long, difficult time on a planet that had not made things easy for them, they had developed a relationship with pain that no other species had. They had learned not to obey it automatically. They had learned to hear it as information and then to make a separate decision about what to do next. She said the closest word she had found in the consortium's existing literature was a human word. The word was grit. She said it meant something like the choice to continue despite having every reason not to. She said it was not a biological trait. It was not something in the body. She said it lived somewhere between the feeling and the response in the space where the body said stop and the person said not yet. She said in 43 species catalogued over 60 years of consortium research, no other species had this space. Humans had built a civilization in it. The hall was very still. Arith leaned forward. He said this was interesting. He said it was very interesting. He said it did not change the fact that 6 students had entered a structurally compromised section in dangerous conditions without formal clearance. Mara said yes, sir. Everyone looked at her. She was sitting in the testimony chairs along the side of the room with the other 5 humans, and she had a bandage on her forearm and a slight bruise along her jaw from where a piece of debris had clipped her, and she sat completely straight. And she had not spoken until now. Earth asked her to confirm her understanding of the clearance issues. She said yes, she understood. They had gone without formal clearance. She said the formal clearance process would have taken 11 minutes minimum, and the ceiling collapse probability was climbing past 50% at the time she had asked Sath to let them through. She said she had made a decision, and she stood by it. Orith said she was describing deliberate rule violations. She said she was describing choosing 31 lives over paperwork. The hall was so quiet, it had a texture. Orith looked at her for a long time. Then he said something that no one expected. He said he had a question that was not part of the formal hearing record, and he asked whether she would answer it. She said yes. He said the question was personal. She said she understood. He said he had reviewed the human intake profiles. He had seen the Verath score. He had seen the word fragile in the biological classification. He said he had written that classification himself 12 years ago based on the data available at the time, and he said it had seemed accurate then, and he wanted to know where it was wrong. Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she said it was not wrong. The room stirred. She said the data was accurate. Humans were sensitive. They heard easily, and they heard deeply in ways that did not always show on scans. She said emotional pain in particular was something human biology processed with the same severity as physical damage. She said, grief felt like injury. Loss felt like damage. She said the fragile classification was looking at the right thing. It just stopped too soon, she said fragile meant easy to damage. And she said, yes, humans damaged easily. That was true. That was not the question. She said the question was what happens after. She said every species in the room had something they called strength. She said for most species, strength meant being hard to damage. It meant thickness. It meant armor. It meant a high threshold before the body registered a problem. She said humans had very little of that. What they had instead was the capacity to be completely broken and choose to stand up anyway. She said they had practiced it for 200,000 years on a world that had earthquakes and disease and winter and predators and loss, and they had not always survived, but the ones who did had passed something down, and that something was not a body that could not be hurt. It was a mind that had learned that being hurt was not the last word. She said she had lost 2 people she loved more than she could explain to a room full of strangers. She said she had lain in her bunk morning after and thought about stopping. She said the pain was real and complete and accurate, and she had felt all of it. She said she got up anyway, and she said that was not a medical anomaly or an evolutionary curiosity or research finding. She said that was a choice, and she said humans made that choice every single day and had been making it since before they had words for it. And she said as long as there were people in rooms that needed to be reached through, corridors that were too hot and too sharp and too unstable, they would keep making it. The hall was silent for a very long time. Then Vara stood up. He was not on the testimony list. He was a student. He had no official standing to speak, and he stood up anyway, and he said he wanted to make a formal request to the consortium. Bordereth looked at him and said, proceed. Vareth said he wanted to formally request that the consortium curriculum be expanded to include the study of human endurance philosophy. He said he did not mean human history or human biology, though both were valuable. He meant the specific practice of how humans manage the space between feeling pain and choosing action. He said he believed it was the most important thing he had encountered in 3 years at this institution, and he said he thought every species in the consortium would be better for learning. I said he was Drek Kai. He said his people believed strength was the absence of weakness. He said he had believed that his whole life. He said he had been wrong. He said strength was not the absence of weakness. Strength was what you built in the places where weakness had been. He said he had watched 6 humans walk into a burning corridor for 31 strangers and come out the other side bleeding and tired, and immediately checking on everyone else before they checked on themselves. And he said he did not have a word for that. In his own language, he said he wanted to learn the human word. The vote was unanimous. Every species, every board member, every faculty representative. It passed without a single objection. Outside the hall in the corridor, Mara sat on a bench with her back against the wall and her eyes closed. She was tired in the way that goes into the bones. She was tired in the way that only comes after something real. Dag sat beside her. He was quiet for once. After a while he said they voted yes. She said she knew he said they were going to teach grit to the galaxy. She said, yeah. He was quiet again for a moment. Then he said James and Yui would have thought that was funny. Her eyes were still closed, but something changed in her face. It moved and settled, and she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, yeah, they would have. She opened her eyes. She looked up at the ceiling of the corridor, at the plain white panels and the recycled light, and she thought about a photograph on a desk in a small room and 6 people standing in front of a broken wall somewhere far away, and the way James laughed, and the way Yui always made a terrible joke. At exactly the right moment, she thought about the morning she got up. She thought about every morning she had gotten up since. She reached into her pocket and took out the small folded piece of paper and unfolded it and looked at the word pitiable for the last time. Then she folded it carefully and she let it go. She watched it fallen. She was already thinking about tomorrow.